Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us on this Wednesday, almost spring evening. We're very glad to have you here. And we are glad to have our presenter here with us this evening, our very own Beth Donnelly, who is the director of Commonwealth Learning Center here in Needham. Beth will be presenting this evening on Orton-Gillingham, providing an introduction of the learning approach. She is a certified member of the Orton-Gillingham Academy herself at the associate level, and she is trained and certified in various other multisensory evidence-based approaches such as Project Read, Nancy Bell Visualizing and Verbalizing, and the Linda Mood Phoneme Sequencing Program as well. She has over 30 years of experience teaching students with dyslexia, ADHD, dysgraphia, and expressive and receptive language disorders. And she is a diagnostic and prescriptive practitioner who enjoys meeting the individual needs of her students and observing their growth as readers and writers. She holds a master's degree in education from Fordham University and was discussing this presentation with Beth earlier this evening, and I said that she is one of the OGs of OG. So we are delighted to have her presenting here with us this evening, and I will turn it over to you, Beth.
All right. Thanks, Stacy, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me tonight. So my hope is that if you are not familiar with Orton-Gillingham, that you'll gain a greater understanding of what it is. And if you're already familiar with Orton-Gillingham, that you'll come away with some new information. Okay, so a little bit more about me. So this is me by the numbers. So this is my 33rd year of teaching, which when I say that out loud, it's kind of incredible. I can't believe that much time has passed. It's my 26th year at Commonwealth Learning Center. So I began at the Learning Center as a part-time teacher. Then I became a full-time teacher. And then for 10 years, I was assistant director. And I'm in my 11th year as director of the Learning Center. And I wear a couple of different hats at the center. So I oversee the daily operations of the center. I also have a caseload of students that I see, and I tutor them in reading and writing. And then I also do educational evaluations at the center. So this is my 21st year of teaching OG. Orton-Gillingham is something I'm really passionate about. I think it's a great approach, a really effective approach, and I really enjoy using it with my students. And as Stacy mentioned, I'm certified at the associate level with the Orton-Gillingham Academy. Okay, so here's what we're going to go over tonight. So we'll start out by talking about the origins of Orton-Gillingham and where it all started. Then I want to talk a little bit about phonics versus whole language, in case you're not familiar with whole language. And then I'll talk a little bit about Orton-Gillingham basics. I'll talk briefly about the science of reading and where Orton-Gillingham fits in with that. Then I'll do a deeper dive into Orton-Gillingham instructional principles, as well as the Orton-Gillingham lesson. So my hope is when I go over the Orton-Gillingham lesson, you'll get an idea of what a student might experience during a typical lesson. And then we'll wrap it up with some takeaways and some resources, and then I can take any questions. And I'll pause throughout the presentation and take any questions that might arise as the presentation progresses. Okay, so before we get into Orton-Gillingham, I just wanted to go over what dyslexia is. So it's a disability that's neurological in origin, and it interferes with the processing and acquisition of language. And it's important to note that it varies in degrees of severity. It can be mild, it can be moderate, or it can be severe. It just depends on the student. And it's characterized by difficulty with accurate or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. It's not the result of a lack of intelligence or motivation. That's a common misconception. And I want to point out the picture that's on the screen. So on the screen is a picture of the left hemisphere of the brain, both in a typical reader and in a dyslexic reader. So there's more activation in the right hemisphere of the brain of a dyslexic rather than the left hemisphere. And the left hemisphere is the language center of the brain. So dyslexic brains show disruptions in the rear reading system in the left hemisphere. So if you look at the picture of the typical reader up here, you see that there's activity in the rear of the left hemisphere, whereas in the dyslexic reader, when they're reading, there's no activity in the rear of the left hemisphere. And we're able to gain that information from functional MRIs. So it's amazing the science that we're able to do in terms of reading and, the brain of a dyslexic and a typical reader. Okay, so let's get into the origins of Orton-Gillingham. So to do that, we need to talk about who Orton was and who Gillingham was. So Dr. Samuel Orton, so he was a neuropsychiatrist and pathologist, and he was a pioneer in focusing attention on reading difficulties related to language processing difficulties. So in the 1920s, he studied children and adolescents who were not reading as expected. So what he did was he labeled this disorder as, and this is a funny term, he named it stressosymbolia, or twisted symbols. And the reason he did that was that these students were reversing letters and they weren't able to sequence sounds correctly within words when they were reading. So before the term dyslexia came to be, he used that term stressosymbolia. And he hypothesized that the brain wiring of these students was different. And he was absolutely right, because when we look at the slide before this one, and we saw the brains of the typical reader and the dyslexic reader, you can absolutely see that the brain wiring is different. And he experimented with multisensory methods to teach these students how to read and how to spell. And we'll go into multisensory a little bit later on in the presentation. Okay, and then there was Anna Gillingham, who worked alongside Dr. Orton. And she was a gifted teacher and psychologist, and she had a superb mastery of the English language. So because of that superb mastery, she introduced a systematic approach to categorizing phonograms, syllable types, morphemes, and spelling generalizations. So she was able to come up with a scope and sequence of skills based on her mastery of the English language. And she worked closely with Dr. Orton to train teachers in this multisensory methodology. She also compiled and published instructional materials as well. And in a couple of slides, you'll see one of the materials that she published. So that's all about Anna Gillingham. So it all started with Dr. Orton and Anna Gillingham. Okay, so phonics versus whole language. Okay, so there's a debate that's been going on for a long time about the best way to teach reading, and it's been raging for decades. So we call this the reading wars, and there are opposing factions of experts, policymakers, and politicians who champion phonics on the one side or whole language on the other. So I'm going to talk about phonics and whole language so you have an idea of the differences between the two. Okay, so a phonics approach recognizes that while humans are wired to speak, they're not wired to read. And reading is not a natural process. So we're not born knowing how to read. We need to learn how to read. The whole language approach, or whole language, is based on the notion that humans are biologically wired to read, and reading is a universal natural skill. So those are the two opposing factions there. So I'm going to compare both of those a little bit in a little bit more detail. Okay, so a phonics approach is a code emphasis where we're linking sounds to letters, whereas a whole language approach is focusing on comprehension. It's a meaning emphasis approach. Phonics is a parts to whole approach where you're going from letters to words, whereas a whole language approach, you're going from whole to parts. You're going from the whole word to its individual letters. In a phonics approach, skills are taught explicitly and directly, so nothing is inferred, whereas in a whole language approach, skills are taught in context. In a phonics approach, skills are organized by sound pattern, whereas with whole language, they're organized by the meaning. And then stories are selected in a phonics approach based on the phonics skills that are being learned. Whereas with a whole language approach, stories are selected based on story plot and characters. And in a phonics approach, teachers encourage students to sound out unknown words. They give them the skills to attack unfamiliar words. Whereas with a whole language approach, the teacher encourages the child to guess from context and picture clues. So a lot of times the child is encouraged to look at the first letter and guess based on what the first letter is in the word, or guess based on what the sentence is saying and what might be a good word to put in that sentence, or they might encourage the student to just skip the word overall. Okay, so we'll talk about some Orton-Gillingham basics. So this is the picture that I was referring to a little bit earlier in terms of Anna Gillingham. So this is a picture of the Gillingham manual that she created. And she created it along with Bessie Stillman, who was another gifted educator. And together they created this manual for Orton-Gillingham teachers that specifically goes through the scope and sequence of phonics skills. Okay, so what's important to note, first of all, is that Orton-Gillingham is an approach to reading instruction. It's not a program, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. So an approach to reading instruction follows a general sequence of skills, but it varies depending on the student. Lessons are designed or customized for each student or group, and more emphasis is on diagnostic and prescriptive teaching. And I'll talk a bit about that later on in the presentation. And there's more teacher created materials. Most Orton-Gillingham teachers are going to create materials that are specific to the student. Okay, and then on the other side, if you look at a program follows a scripted sequence of skills, whereas with Orton-Gillingham, there's more leeway. And in a program, lessons are generally already designed by the publisher, and materials are provided by the publisher. But if you look in the middle, this is where they are the same. And this is what's really important. They're the same in that they're both multisensory, they're structured, they're systematic, they're cumulative, they're alphabetic. That means that our language is based on an alphabetic principle. Again, that sounds are associated with letters, and that it's direct instruction. So these principles are what they have in common and what makes either one really effective. So that's just a compare and contrast of what an approach is compared to a program, and Orton-Gillingham is an approach. Okay, so on this screen or on this slide, there are some examples of programs that are based on Orton-Gillingham principles. So Foundations in Wilson are by Barbara Wilson. Wilson was created first by Barbara in the late 80s for students really sixth grade up to adult, but now it's used widely among all grade levels. And then Foundations came after, and Foundations is targeted for kindergarten through second grade. Lindemood Bell programs, those are by Nancy Bell and Phyllis Lindemood. There's PAF, which stands for Preventing Academic Failure, and that was created by two educators from New York. And then there's SPIRE by Sheila Clark Edmonds, and SPIRE stands for Specialized Program for Individualized Reading Excellence. So these are some examples of programs that are based on Orton-Gillingham principles. Okay, so here's some basics about Orton-Gillingham. So again, it's an instructional approach for teaching reading and spelling to struggling readers. It's used primarily with dyslexic learners, elementary age to adult, and it breaks the code of the English language. So dyslexic students need the reading process spelled out for them. So Orton-Gillingham really breaks that code of how letters are associated with sounds, or there are certain sounds associated with letters. And one lesson addresses both reading and spelling. And handwriting is also woven into the lesson. This is important because typically students, like dyslexic learners, struggle with letter formation. So this is a really important feature of the Orton-Gillingham lesson. Okay, so Orton-Gillingham is commonly used as a one-on-one instructional model, but it's not uncommon for it to be used in a small group or in the whole classroom. Orton-Gillingham practitioners design lessons and materials specific to a student's needs. Okay, so this is an important slide because the Orton-Gillingham lesson is not just phonics. There's a lot of other components that are woven into the lesson. So for example, vocabulary is woven into the lesson, and that could be done in a couple of ways. The teacher can talk about multiple meanings of words, or the teacher can choose unfamiliar words to put in a word list. Examples might be like bog or lug or frantic, words that the student might not be familiar with already. Another thing the teacher might do is have the student categorize words according to meaning. Another component, and usually this is with more advanced students, is morphology. And morphology is the study of the structure of words as it relates to meaning. So what does that mean? So that means we're talking about prefixes, which are parts of words that are added to the beginning of a word. We're talking about suffixes, which are parts of words that are added to the end. And then we're talking about the roots, which is the meaning base of the word. So an example here is the word constructed. So if you look at this example, con is the prefix, which means with or thoroughly. Struct is the root, which means to build. And ed is the suffix, which means past tense. And then we get into some sight word instruction. So if you're not familiar with sight words are either words that are seen so frequently that students know them by sight, or they're words that are not phonetic. They can't be sounded out, so the student has to memorize those words. And one way we practice that here at the Learning Center is by doing something called trace, copy, and cover, where we write a sight word down and we have the student trace the letters. Then we have them copy the word. And then finally, we have them cover the word so that they can copy it without or write it without looking at it, so they can memorize that visual pattern. Comprehension is also woven into the lesson. That's typically done at the end of the lesson when the students are reading connected text. So we can weave in discussions about main idea or plot or characters or inferences. And then finally, grammar is something that can be woven into the lesson. That can be woven in by talking about parts of speech. For example, a teacher might ask the student to categorize a word list according to nouns and action words. So all of these elements can be woven into the Orton-Gillingham lesson for a really rich lesson that's more than just phonics. Okay, so I'm going to touch briefly on the science of Orton-Gillingham. The science of reading in Orton-Gillingham and where Orton-Gillingham fits in. Okay, so this is a simple view of reading. So reading starts out with a student decoding words or recognizing words. So that's the ability to read individual words. And then you multiply that by oral language comprehension, the ability to understand spoken language. And all of that equals reading comprehension, the ability to understand printed text. The ultimate goal of reading is to be able to gain information and to gain meaning. So that's the simple view or the simple equation or formula for reading. Okay, so what is the science of reading? Because that's in the headlines a lot in education right now. So it's a body of research from experts in education, psychology, neurology, and more that provides the information we need to understand how students learn to read. And it's also demystified how we learn to read and offers evidence backed by science to confirm that there is one right way to teach reading, which is phonics. And it helps us understand the cognitive processes essential for reading proficiency. And it helps us understand the best way to teach reading based on how the brain processes language and how it processes letters. So this might come as a surprise to some people in the audience, but there's no specific research surrounding Orton-Gillingham, and that's because it's an approach. It can't be studied as carefully in the same way a program can. Programs based on Orton-Gillingham principles can potentially be researched because the instruction is uniform, it's scripted, and used the same way for all students. But it's the tenets or principles on which Orton-Gillingham is based that make it effective. And those tenets are evidence-based and science of reading-based. And we're going to get into those instructional principles in a little bit. But again, there's no specific research surrounding Orton-Gillingham because it's an approach and not a program. Okay, so some of the tenets of OG that are supported by the science of reading. So phonics is the primary approach to teaching reading. This approach prepares students to become fluent and proficient readers, and it helps students develop the knowledge and skill about how the alphabet works. It also helps students understand the hows and whys behind reading. So for example, if I gave a student, say, the word grip, I would directly tell them how that's a closed syllable. I would directly say that it has one vowel, the vowel's closed in by a consonant, and the vowel sound is short. And then for the Y, I would say when you see that word, you need to use the short vowel sound because it's a closed syllable. And then Orton-Gillingham incorporates recommended multisensory instructional techniques. And again, we'll get into that a little bit later on. Okay, I love this quote. So this quote is from a leading reading researcher named David Kilpatrick. And he states, "We teach reading in different ways. Students learn to read proficiently in one way," which is what I've been saying in this, as far as I've come in this presentation, is that it's phonics. So I really think that's a powerful statement, and I really love that quote. Okay, so Orton-Gillingham empowers students because it's a parts to whole approach rather than whole to parts. So we're going from letters to words, and words are not memorized. So let's take a look at the next slide and I'll explain more what I mean by this. So I really like this slide, and I based this slide on an ancient proverb that says, "Give a person a fish and you feed her for a day. Teach her how to fish and you feed her for a lifetime." So if we take that in terms of reading, if we teach students how to crack the code of our language, that's more beneficial than having them memorize a bunch of words. So by teaching them the code of our English, of our language, then we're helping them become lifelong readers. So if you look at the slide, if we give students 10 words to memorize, they're only going to know those 10 words. However, if you give them 10 letters, then they're going to be able to read 353 sound words, 4,324 sound words, and 21,655 sound words. So I would say that's empowering. So I think that's a powerful slide, and those are powerful numbers. Okay, so now we're going to dive into the principles of Orton-Gillingham. Okay, so Orton-Gillingham is what we call diagnostic and prescriptive. So the teacher is always monitoring the responses of the student to identify and analyze problems and progress. So a teacher during the Orton-Gillingham lesson is always taking notes and making observations and using that information for how she plans for the next lesson. It's a prescriptive approach because instruction contains elements to focus on the student's difficulties and building on their progress. And then data from each lesson informs how to plan for the next. So to give you an example of being diagnostic and prescriptive, I was working with one of my students last week, and we were working on the open syllable type. And sprinkled throughout the lesson as review were some words with the EA vowel team. And as we were going through the lesson, I noticed that this student was struggling with reading these words with the EA vowel team. So that told me that EA wasn't solid yet, as I thought it was. So I needed to go back and create some lessons for EA to make sure that was solid. So I was being diagnostic and prescriptive. Instead of plowing through and continuing with open syllable for the next lesson, it told me I needed to go back and spiral back to the EA vowel team. Okay, so Orton-Gillingham is individualized. So that means instruction is individualized to meet the needs of the student, and lessons are customized to the student's profile, culture, and interests. So to give you some examples, so typically when a student who's in the first or second grade comes to the center, they're typically going to start right at the beginning of the scope and sequence of skills. They're going to most likely start at the closed syllable type, which is the most common syllable type in our language. Maybe they have a little bit of phonics skills under their belt. Maybe they know short A and short O, but we need to work on short I and E and U. So that's really individualizing it. If a student comes to the center and they're in third grade or up, we would have to do a phonics inventory. We use the quick phonics screener here at the center. And we would do this phonics screener to gain an understanding of what phonics knowledge the student has. And then we can pinpoint where there are gaps in the student's knowledge. And that will help us figure out where to start in the scope and sequence. It's not cookie cutter. You're not starting at the same point with every student. So by doing that phonics screener, you're going to individualize the scope and sequence for that particular student. And then in terms of customizing to culture and interests, a way that can be woven into the lesson is, say, for example, the student is a real fan of the Red Sox. You can weave in some sentences about Red Sox players or weave in some vocabulary about baseball. And then in terms of culture, if a student celebrates a certain holiday related to their culture, vocabulary words surrounding the holiday or sentences surrounding the holiday could be woven in, or a passage about the holiday could be read at the end of the lesson. So Orton-Gillingham is language-based. So instruction is based on the structure and history of the English language. Instruction begins at the simplest level, sounds, and the relationship between letters and sounds. And then it progresses to complex word and text structure. So you're going from letters and sounds to single syllables, progressing to two syllables, and then multi-syllable words. So there's that progression. Okay, so here's that simultaneous multisensory that I was alluding to earlier in the presentation. So instruction is simultaneously utilizes the associations of auditory, meaning hearing, visual, meaning seeing, and kinesthetic, meaning movement, modalities of learning. So that means by presenting information in this way, students are going to understand the concepts better and they're going to remember them better. So let me give you some examples. So for example, if I was working, say, on short A and short O with a student, for that auditory visual, I could show them the phonogram card for A, and I would say A says ah as an apple. So they're seeing the letter and they're hearing the sound. So that's that auditory and visual. Then I would say, show them the short O card, and I would say, O says ah, like an octopus. And again, they're seeing the letter and they're hearing the sound. Another example would be related to short A and short O. Maybe on the whiteboard, I put an A and an O on the whiteboard, and I give the student a fly swatter. And I dictate some words with short A and short O, and the student has to listen for the ah or the ah sound. So as I'm dictating the words, the student has to listen for the vowel sound. Then they need to use the fly swatter to hit either the A or the O on the whiteboard. And then as they hit the letter, they need to say the vowel sound. So they're hearing the sound, they're seeing the letters on the whiteboard, and they're moving their arm with the fly swatter. So that's a good example of a multisensory activity. One last example might be in terms of short A and short O as the example, might be to have the student give the student a word list and have them highlight all the short A's and short O's in the words before they read. So that's a good example of visual and kinesthetic, where they're seeing the words and the letters, and then they're highlighting. So that gives you some examples of what multisensory is. And when we get into the Orton-Gillingham lesson, I can talk a little bit more about it again. Okay, so Orton-Gillingham is what we call direct and explicit. So concepts are clearly stated and they're modeled. So typically it's that the teacher does it, the student and the teacher does it, and then the student does it. It's that gradual release of responsibility. And then skills are practiced. Nothing is inferred. So you're directly and clearly explaining everything. So for example, if I was doing the silent E syllable type with a student, I would directly tell them that when you see an E at the end of a word, that E is going to be quiet. It's not going to make a sound, but what it's going to do is it's going to make the vowel in front of it say its name in words like, say, ride or cape. So I'm directly teaching that. The student doesn't need to guess what I'm trying to explain. And then the instruction requires constant student and teacher interaction. So a student's not going to sit in the lesson and fill out a bunch of worksheets. The student and the teacher are constantly going to be engaging in different learning activities throughout the lesson. So the other thing I wanted to point out was this picture that's on the screen. So this is a sample of a page from a student reference binder. So students who do Orton-Gillingham create a reference binder, and within that reference binder, there are sounds, there are syllable types, there's spelling generalizations. There's also, that's where we keep the spelling dictations. And the student can refer to this binder at any time throughout the lesson. So if you look at this particular page, this is from the sound section that a student created this page. And the teacher directly told the student about the silent E syllable type. That's what this page is about. And on the left are the letters and the keywords. And then on the right, the student created a picture for the keyword. So it's really getting the student engaged with the learning and directly teaching them what the concepts are all about. So I think that's a pretty powerful tool for the student to be able to be part of creating the materials that they refer to. Okay, so Orton-Gillingham is what we call structured, sequential, and cumulative, but flexible. So you're always going from the simple to the complex. New concepts are always built on previously learned ones. So for example, if I had been working on the closed syllable type, so an example might be the word cap, and then I wanted to advance to the silent E syllable type, then I would add an E on the end of cap to make it cape. So I'm building on what was previously known to the unknown. Then you're always spiraling back to previously learned skills. That's really important, especially for dyslexic learners. They need a lot of repetition because they need to overlearn concepts to the point of automaticity. They really need to internalize those concepts. And the way to do that is to spiral back, just like in my example earlier, where I was working on the open syllable type, but I had to spiral back to Val Team EA because it wasn't solid yet with the student. So you're always spiraling back to previously learned skills. That's critical. That's crucial for a teacher to be able to do that for a student. And then flexibility. So the scope and sequence of skills with Orton-Gillingham is flexible. So like I mentioned earlier, so if a third grader comes to the center, they might have some phonics knowledge. Maybe they already know closed syllable and they know silent E syllable, and they know those in single syllable words, but then maybe I move on then to two syllable words that combine closed and silent E, maybe a word like invite or compete. So because they knew those single syllables of closed and silent E, I could combine them into two syllable words. So that's being flexible. So that's a really important component of the Orton-Gillingham approach. Whereas with a program, there's not always that same flexibility. Okay, so Orton-Gillingham is synthetic and analytic. So what does that mean? So synthetic refers to the reading part of the lesson, where the student is blending sounds to create, or syllables to create a word. So if you look at the example down here, I separated the sounds, b, at, but we're blending them together to equal the word bat, b, at, bat. So that's going from the parts to eat from each individual sound to the whole word. Whereas analytic is the opposite. That's the spelling part that the student needs to do. So you're going from the whole to the parts. So you're going from the whole word bat, and then you're segmenting. You're segmenting the b, the a, and the t, so that you can spell it. Okay, so this is really important. So the Orton-Gillingham approach is cognitive. So what does that mean? So that means that it encourages students to think and reason rather than memorize. So it encourages students to think about what they're learning, why they're learning it, and how to apply their learning. So an example might be for what they're learning. If I'm working with a student, say I'm going to introduce the Val Team AI, I would directly tell them, we're going to work on Val Team AI. And when you see AI together, they're going to make the long A sound. Then why are they learning it? So that they know how to read the words that have the AI Val Team, and they know to use the long A sound when they see it. And then how to apply their learning, that could be in a couple of different ways. That could be reading the words. It could be reading sentences with words that have the AI Val Team. I could ask a student to look at a word list and find all the words that are the AI vowel team and have them circle those vowel teams. So it's really encouraging them to really think about what they're learning. And it's getting them to think outside the box about language and getting them not to memorize. So the last instructional principle is that Orton-Gillingham is emotionally sound. So this is critical. So you have to build confidence and trust with a student. So it's really important to establish that rapport. If you don't establish that rapport, then learning's not going to happen. And you want to build that trust so that students are willing to take risks within a lesson. So I was working with a student recently, and he came on the screen, and immediately he told me he had a bad day at school. So I had to, validate his feelings. I had to reassure him that I understood where he was coming from, that we would just take our time during the lesson, that he could take as many breaks as he needed to take, that he could choose some of the things that we did during the lesson. So by doing all of that, we had a really successful lesson. So a teacher needs to ask themselves, has the student had a bad day at school? Did they not get enough sleep last night? Are they feeling anxious? All of those components are what that can affect the lesson. So it's really important for the Orton-Gillingham teacher to be in tune with those things. And then students have to achieve consistent success. And the way that's achieved is that teachers, Orton-Gillingham teachers, create lessons in such a way so that students feel successful and they don't feel frustrated. The last thing you want to do is have a student feel frustrated throughout the lesson, and that's just going to, decrease their confidence. So you really want to build their confidence by having them achieve that consistent success. Stacy, are there any questions? I think this might be a good point to stop and see if there are any questions.
The only question so far was about whether the presentation was being recorded and if the slides would be shared. And I noted that both of those are indeed the case. We will send
Okay,
out the
great.
slides and the recording tomorrow.
Okay, thanks, Stacy. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to talk about the Orton-Gillingham lesson. And I want to describe it in such a way so that you get an idea of what a student would experience during an Orton-Gillingham lesson. So for every Orton-Gillingham lesson, there are 3 associations or levels of learning woven into the lesson. So this next slide is going to be a picture of an Orton-Gillingham lesson plan that we use at the center. And I just wanted to give you an idea of what it looks like. So if you look at the top part, that's association 1, which is symbol to sound or oral reading. Association 2 is down here, which is sound to symbol. And on the right, I want to point out this is where the teacher will collect the data that will inform how to plan for the next lesson. She'll note any errors. She'll note the accuracy rate of word reading and sentence reading over here. So this is a critical part of the lesson plan. And then on this next slide is the second page of the lesson plan. So this is association 3, which is the spelling dictation. So I'm going to go into each part of the lesson as we progress through the rest of the presentation. Okay, so association 1. So association 1 involves a sound drill. It involves introducing the lesson objective. The student does some single word reading. Then they progress to contextual reading, reading sentences. And then there are games or a game woven into the lesson. What I want to point out is what's not on this slide is something called phonemic awareness. So some students need a phonemic awareness activity at the beginning of the lesson. So what's phonemic awareness? So phonemic awareness is the ability to manipulate speech sounds. So this skill is critical. This skill has to be sound in order for a student to be a successful reader or speller. And it's a basic foundational skill. So I'll give you an example. So if I said to a student, say the word gap, they would have to repeat the word gap. Then I would say, what's the first sound in gap? And hopefully they would respond, g. And then I might say, what's the last sound in gap? And they would say, p. Another example, so that's manipulating small parts or small chunks of words. An example of manipulating larger chunks of language might be if I said to the student, say the word snowman. Now say the word snowman without saying man, and they would have to respond snow. So not all students need that drill at the beginning. Some students do need that, and it's only a couple of minutes. It's not very long. It's a quick hit of phonemic awareness, and then the rest of the lesson can progress. Okay, so like I mentioned, there's a sound drill at the beginning of the lesson, and that's done with phonogram cards. So this is a picture of the phonogram cards that are used during the Orton-Gillingham lesson. So the phonogram drill is typically 2 to 3 minutes. I want to point out the colors of the phonogram cards. So the consonants are white, and the vowels, as you'll notice, are like a salmon orangey color, and that's purposeful. And the reason for that is that when a teacher is building words for the student to read with the phonogram cards, the students can see the consonant and vowel patterns, and then they can identify the syllable types. And the teacher is not going to do every single sound the student knows in the drill, but she's also not going to put in any sounds that the student hasn't already been exposed to. And a way to make this a cognitive task, that cognitive principle I mentioned earlier, is maybe having the student categorize sounds. So maybe having the student put all the vowels that say A in one pile and all the vowels that say E in another. That's a way to get them thinking and reasoning and not just saying the sounds. So after the sound drill, the students do word reading, and that can come in a couple of ways. So on the screen is an example of a word list that we might give a student. So notice that these words are all one syllable, and they all have either AR or OR. And AR and OR are what we call the R-controlled syllable type. So that's what this particular student would be working on if they were presented with these words. And typically a teacher would probably have the student highlight the AR and the OR in all of those words in order to bring attention to that pattern. Then the student would either just read the words aloud, or they might read them silently and then read them aloud. Another thing that can be done during the word reading portion of a lesson is to have students do word sorts. I think word sorts are a great multisensory activity. Students can sort according to syllable type. They can sort according to spelling generalizations or rules, or they can sort according to vowel sound. It just depends. Another thing that can be done during this part of the lesson is giving students or having a stack of words on index cards, and there's just one word on each card, and then timing the student for a minute and seeing how many words they can read in a minute for fluency. And then another thing that can be done is, like I mentioned in the previous slide, is that teachers can build words using those phonogram cards and have students read words that way. Okay, so this is another example of a word list a student might get. And this one is different because the words are 2-syllable words. So this is a student that'll be working on 2-syllable words. So I want to call your attention to this first word, confuse. So this is a combination of a closed syllable, con, and a silent E syllable, fuse. So typically what the teacher would do would have this, they would have the student divide the word into its syllables before they read the word to practice syllable division. So here, the student would first underline the 2 vowels that are making a sound, the O and the U, and they would put a slash through the E because the E is silent. And then above the O and the U, they would put a letter V for vowel. And then they would look between the O and the U, and they would see that there's 2 consonants between the O and the U. Then they would put a C above the N for consonant and a C above the F for consonant. That would tell them, okay, there's 2 consonants between the vowels, and I need to divide right between those consonants. And then they would read confuse. Another thing I've done is, and other teachers might do, is put the words up on the whiteboard and have the students divide the syllables on the whiteboard. That's a great way to make it multisensory. Another way I've done it is to put the words, each word on an index card and have the students cut the syllables so that they have the first and second syllable. That's another great multisensory activity. So after the word reading, the students are going to engage in some sentence reading, and that can come in different forms. I like this activity quite a bit. Students can have a lot of fun with this. This is called Would You Rather. And you can do silly sentences with this activity, which students really get a kick out of. So during sentence reading, this is practicing reading in context, like I mentioned with that's separate from the single word reading that was on the other slide. So with Would You Rather, the student would say, would you rather skate on a pond or sled down a slope? Would you rather eat a candy treat or feast on snail soup? And this is a good way to practice reading questions. Typically, dyslexic learners really have difficulty reading questions, having that inflection at the end of the sentence for a question. So this is good practice for that. Also, during sentence reading, you're practicing fluency. So I'll give you an example of that on the next slide. But this is a great activity for sentence reading. Rather than just giving some regular sentences for a student to read, it really makes it fun. And another way to make it cognitive, get them thinking about what they're learning, is just to after they've read all the sentences, you can say, okay, can you now circle all the words with the vowel team? So they could circle treat and feast. They could circle snail and soup and good and book and so forth. And I also want to point out that on this page, these particular sentences, this would be with a student that's had has been exposed to quite a few phonic skills. So they've been exposed to several vowel teams. They've been exposed to the open syllable and Y saying E. They've been exposed to NK words. So they have quite a few different phonic skills under their belt to be exposed to this type of text. So this is another example of what can be done during the sentence reading portion of the lesson. So this is riddles. So I want to bring your attention to the right side of the page. So on the right side are the answers to the riddles. And these are two-syllable words. And these two-syllable words are actually, they only have one consonant between the vowels. So if you look at cozy, the Z is between the O and the Y. So we would divide right before the Z to make the first syllable open. So this particular student is working on the open syllable combined with closed syllables and silent E syllables. So the teacher would most likely have the student read these words before having them read the riddles, so they're familiar with the answers. Then they would have the student read the sentence. So for example, the student would say, this blackbird chomps on small mammals, birds, and reptiles. And hopefully the student would answer raven. I also want to point out this is also a student that's been exposed to two-syllable words. They've been exposed to the R-controlled syllable type. So they've had several skills under their belt before they've been exposed to this type of text. And again, you're practicing fluency. So this teacher could read the riddle first and the student could echo back. That's a way to practice fluency. The teacher, after the student has done all the riddles, the teacher could have the student go back and reread all the riddles again for an extra hit of fluency. And I want to point out some other examples that I haven't presented in terms of what can be done for sentence reading. So that could be yes or no questions. It could be fill in the blank. And it could also be phrases. So some students might not be ready for full sentences. So that's being diagnostic and prescriptive, really determining, is my student ready for sentences? And if they're not, then you can just do phrases. There's nothing wrong with that. So the teacher is always analyzing what the student needs. Okay, then we would weave a game into the lesson. So games are woven into the lesson and they're skill-based and they're motivating. And obviously the student really looks forward to this part of the lesson. So this particular game is boxing words. And I'll explain how this game works. Before I do that, I want to point out that all the words for this particular game are one syllable and they're silent E. So that means all the vowels are going to say their name. So the teacher and the student each have a colored marker and the markers are different colors. Then if it's the student's turn, they would either draw a line vertically or horizontally. If they drew a line vertically, then they would read the word to the right and to the left of the line, cute, mule. If they drew a line horizontally, then they would read the word above and below the line, theme, bike. Then whenever it's either the teacher or the student's turn and they could close the box, that means they can color in the square with their marker. So the person who has the most squares with their color at the end of the game wins. So it's a simple game, but the students really enjoy it and it gets them to reinforce the skill that's being taught during the lesson. So this is another example of a game we might do during a lesson. This one's called Roll and Read. So let me point out the words that are on this particular game. So on this particular game, these are two-syllable words. So they're two-syllable words that are combining open syllable with either closed, silent E, or bossy R. So that's really important to note. So when it's the student's turn, they roll a die. So say they rolled a 3. So if they rolled a 3, they would go to this column and they pick a word. So say they picked the word beyond. They would have to read the word, then they would have to put an X through the word. And then the person who has 4 in a row, 4 up and down, or 4 diagonally first wins the game. Again, a very simple concept, but it's fun for the students and it makes it very engaging and motivating.
We've had
Okay.
another question come in, Beth.
Okay.
The question is, what are your thoughts on the role of rapid naming on reading fluency slash Ravo?
That's a really good question. I know of Ravo, but I don't have a lot of familiarity with it. So I wouldn't feel comfortable commenting on it, but I can certainly get back to you. My email is going to be at the end of the presentation, and feel free to email me about it. But again, I'm not well versed in Ravo, so I don't feel comfortable commenting on it. But thank you for the question. Sorry, I'm not able to answer it. Okay. So this brings us to association 2. So association 2 is a reverse sound drill. So if you remember at the beginning of the lesson, there was a sound drill, but that was with the phonogram cards, where the students saw the letter and they would have to say the sound. This is the reverse, where the teacher says the sound and then the students have to come up with the letters. And this is only 1 to 2 minutes. And again, the teacher's not going to do every sound the student knows. They're going to just do the ones that the student is familiar with. So if the teacher says what says E, depending on the student might respond E, E, EA, Y, E consonant E, EY, and EI, say E. That would be a more advanced student. And what's important to note here is the student would have to respond by saying the most common spelling first and going to the least common. And a way to make this multisensory is to either have students air write the letters. They could write the letters in sand, as you can see up here in the pictures. They could write the letters on the table with their fingers. Those are ways to make it multisensory. I've also had students use a rug sample. So for that tactile feeling, or have them use a screen or a bumpy board to again make it very tactile and kinesthetic. So another example that what could happen during the reverse sound drill is I could say, what says ah? And the student would have to say, A says ah. Or if I said, what says, the student would have to say, depending on the student might just say S says, depending on where they are in the scope and sequence. Or they could say S and C say S, depending on where the student is in the scope and sequence of skills. So again, that's just a really quick drill, only 1 to 2 minutes.
Another
Okay, that
question here
brings
for
us,
you.
okay.
This one is, are you familiar with Lexia Core 5 and does that use OG principles?
I am familiar with it, and it does use Orton-Gillingham principles. Long ago, when I first started at the center, we used Lexia, not obviously Lexia 5. It was a different iteration, but I like that a lot, and that's great practice for students. So yes, it does have Orton-Gillingham principles. Okay, so simultaneous oral spelling is the third association, and that's the dictation part of the lesson. And that involves sounds, words, and sentences. So what I'm going to do on the next couple of slides is I'm going to show you examples of some dictations. Okay, so if you look at this particular dictation, first of all, I want to point out that the student did 3 sounds, they did 4 words, and they did 1 sentence. That's what the student was able to do for this dictation, and that's how the teacher planned it according to what the student was capable of doing. So for the sounds, what the teacher would do is she would say, "What says?" And the student would respond, "TH says." Then what the student would need to do is they would need to say the name of the letter as they form it, TH. So that multisensory. Then they would do the same for QU, and they would do the same for short E. Then in terms of the words, first of all, these words I want to point out are the closed syllable type. So this student is near the beginning of the scope and sequence. These words also have 5 sounds. So they have blends like BL and MP, CR and ST. Those are blends. So a couple of things have to happen before the student writes on paper for the words. So the teacher would say the word blimp, and the student would say blimp. Then what the student would need to do is separate each sound. It's that ability to segment that they need to do. So what the student would do is they would name each sound either on their fingers, on the table, or they might use chips, individual colored chips, to separate the sounds. So they would have to say b, ul, I, m. Then after naming each sound, they would have to name the letters B, L, I, M, P. So they need to do all of that before they put their pencil to paper. Then once they've done that, they need to name each letter as they form them. B, L, I, M, P. So they're seeing the letters, they're hearing the sounds, and they're moving their hand, multisensory. Then at the end of the dictation, the teacher dictates a sentence. So the teacher would say, "Can you sprint in the draft?" The student would repeat it. Then they would write the sentence. After they write the sentence, the teacher and the student would edit. So they're looking for the capital letters, they're looking for punctuation, and then the teacher can error correct any spelling. And they would do that with the student, and they would help the student self-correct. I've done dictations with students where I've done 5 sounds, 10 words, and 2 or 3 sentences. So again, it's being diagnostic and prescriptive. What do you think your student is capable of doing? And then that's how you approach the lesson. So I wanted to show you on this next slide a more advanced dictation. So this particular student was doing morphology, that those prefixes, suffixes, and roots that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. So for the sound drill, for the sound part of the dictation, the teacher dictated suffixes. So for the suffix EST, the teacher would say, "What suffix means most?" And hopefully the student would say EST, and then they would say each letter as they form them, EST. Then if you go down to the words, so the words are 2-syllable here, and they have suffixes. So if we look at the word transmitting, so the teacher would say transmitting, then the student would respond or repeat transmitting. Then what they would have to do is, because this word has a suffix on it, they would have to name the base word. The base word is the word without the suffix. So here it would be transmit. So the student would then have to say transmit. Then they would say the first syllable, trans. And at this point, they might just have to name the letters, TRANS. Then for the second syllable, they would say mit, MIT. And again, they're saying the letters as they're forming them. Then what's important here is that this particular student was taught the doubling rule for spelling. So they had to remember to double that T before they added the ing. And then in this dictation, the teacher gave the student 2 sentences. So the dictations vary from student to student. Okay, so at the end of the lesson, the students do they read connected text. And this is either controlled text or uncontrolled text, and it depends on the student. And this is a really important part of the lesson, and it's usually 5 to 10 minutes. And it's important because first, It gives the student the opportunity to apply what they've learned in context to see if they've really internalized those skills. And the teacher can then be diagnostic and prescriptive and see if they have internalized them or if they're, and kind of analyze what errors, if any, they're making. So it provides a lot of great data for the teacher. So in terms of control text, so control text is text that only has the phonics elements that the student has been exposed to. So for this particular passage, which was taken from the University of Florida Literacy Institute, that's an excellent resource for both parents and teachers. So this particular passage was focusing on the R-controlled syllable, particularly ER. So I highlighted all the ER words throughout this passage, so you can see how many there are. And probably the teacher would have the student do the same before they read the passage. And also note that this student most likely had been exposed to two-syllable words, closed syllable, silent E syllable, and then obviously the R-controlled syllable. And they might have also been exposed to, like in the word verge, the G making the J sound. So in order to present this to the student, they need to have those phonics skills under their belt. So again, it's very controlled to what they've learned. And then both fluency and comprehension can be woven into this part of the lesson, even with controlled text. And here are some examples of controlled readers. There's the primary phonics series. So Mac and Tab or Spot are examples from the primary phonics series. Then The Lost Dog and A Great Mess are controlled readers from that Spire series, that program I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. So these are just a sampling. And these are, if you were looking for controlled readers, I would highly recommend either of these series. Okay, then there's uncontrolled text or authentic literature. And a teacher needs to decide when the student is ready for that. So they have to be pretty far along in a sequence to be able to be exposed to uncontrolled text. So here, these are just a sampling, obviously, of some authentic literature that might be used. So for example, Flat Stanley and Freckle Juice by Judy Blume might be used with lower elementary students, whereas Hoot by Carl Hyacin and Wayside School is Falling Down by Lewis Sacker might be used with upper elementary students. And then you have Julie of the Wolves by Jean Craighead George. That might be used with a middle school student. And again, you're weaving in fluency and you're weaving in comprehension. You're going to be talking about plot and character. You're drawing conclusions. You're talking about theme. And that's a component that I had talked about at the beginning of the lesson, at the beginning of the presentation that could be woven into the lesson. Okay, so after talking about Orton-Gillingham in this presentation, you have to ask yourself, why teach phonics? So here are the reasons. Over 80% of English words follow predictable patterns for decoding. Teaching phonics patterns gives students confidence to apply strategies to unknown words. So we're really building their word attack strategies. Without a strategy for chunking larger words into manageable parts, students may look at a longer word and they might resort to guessing what it is, or they might skip it altogether. And then lastly, without learning phonics patterns, students over-rely on pictures and context. And then it's important to note that pictures and context disappear after grades 2 or 3. So it's really, really important to teach them the phonics skills. Oh, sorry. Okay, so this is a great quote. And this is a quote from Louisa Moats, another leading reading researcher. And in 2017, she said, literacy instruction in many schools is not highly explicit or systematic. Important foundational skills like phonemic awareness and decoding often receive limited emphasis, and even for beginners or struggling decoders. I actually interviewed a teacher yesterday from a district out in Western Mass, and she was describing how the school was using a whole language approach, which, given the science of reading and what we know about phonics, is surprising. You'd be surprised how many schools are still adopting a whole language or meaning emphasis approach. Okay, so some key takeaways. So Orton-Gillingham was developed almost 100 years ago by Dr. Samuel Orton and Anna Gillingham, and it's still relevant and very effective today. It's a phonics-based approach to reading instruction. It's not a program, so there's a lot of leeway with the scope and sequence of skills, and it addresses both reading and spelling. It's multisensory, so it taps into the auditory, visual, and kinesthetic neural pathways. So by presenting information in that way, students understand it better and they remember it better. The tenets or principles of Orton-Gillingham are supported by the science of reading. Instruction is guided by a set of 9 principles. And the Orton-Gillingham lesson, as we saw, has 3 associations or levels of learning. Okay, and I wanted to point out some resources. This is just a sampling. So the Orton-Gillingham Academy website is a great resource, both for parents and for teachers. I love the International Dyslexia Association website. I really love their fact sheets. So they have like 1 and 2 pagers, fact sheets about different topics surrounding dyslexia, which I think are great. There's Decoding Dyslexia Massachusetts. So that is Decoding Dyslexia is a grassroots organization that was developed, I want to say, about 10 years or so ago. And that is a great resource because it helps parents understand the legislation behind what's going on in the schools and what's going on for dyslexia in schools. Then there's Learning Ally. Learning Ally is a superb resource for audiobooks. There's Mabida. So Mabida is the Massachusetts branch of the International Dyslexia Association. And then there's the Literacy Nest, which is great for teachers. Literacy Nest has great resources for Orton-Gillingham teachers. I can't say enough about it. So that's just a sampling of some resources. So I hope that you gained some more information or some new information from the presentation. So I'm happy to answer any other questions that you might have at this time. So one question is, can I talk more about the service delivery at our learning center? So the learning center, all the instruction is one-to-one. Sessions are 50 minutes. And the teachers are trained and certified in Orton-Gillingham. Most of them have been certified through the Orton-Gillingham Academy. So I don't know if you could be a little more, if that's some general information. So if you have a more specific question, definitely put it in the chat. Another question is, how do we find further training in Orton-Gillingham? So definitely the Orton-Gillingham website. We also have a professional training institute, and we're a certified training facility. We're certified by the Orton-Gillingham Academy. So if you want to find further information about our professional training institute, you can go to the Commonwealth Learning Center website. That's a great place to go. So I would suggest either going to our website or going to the Orton-Gillingham website. And
We
then I
do have a
see, what is
couple
the,
of training courses coming up this summer for the associate level training certification. And there is a training in June 30th, and then July. It's 7 days each session. So June 30th, July 1st through 3rd, and 7th through 9th is one of them. The second one is August 4th through 7th and 11th through 13th. And I believe at this point in time, both of those virtual courses are about half full. So if that's something you're interested in, go check it out and sign up.
Thanks, Stacy. Okay, so what is the best way to find an OG teacher in the area? So my suggestion is to go to the Orton-Gillingham website because they have a database of Orton-Gillingham certified teachers, and you can search by region or by state, I should say. And I know many parents who have used that website to find a tutor. So I would highly recommend going to the Orton-Gillingham Academy website. I'm gonna go, Stacy, did you look at the Q&A?
Looks like we got a new one there.
Okay.
Yeah, can you see that?
Oh yeah, I do see it. Okay. So it says, I understand that outcome research is hard to come by. What are your personal thoughts about how much time instruction is needed to make substantive, progress in dyslexic readers? Can speed of reading be addressed as well as accuracy? Okay, so the Orton-Gillingham Academy website recommends at least twice a week. 45 to 60 minutes per session. If depending on how severe a dyslexic student is, that might require more intensity. So I've seen students who need 4 to 5 times a week, 60 minutes at a time. So it depends. But definitely we've seen students who come twice a week at the center for 50 minutes each session, and they've made great progress. That progress varies, and I know you probably don't want to hear that, but it varies from student to student. I would say the average is 2 years, but I would say give or take, depending on the severity. And then the other part of the question is, can speed of reading be addressed as well as accuracy? So speed can be addressed a little bit in terms of when I was talking about the word reading part of the lesson. So students can do a word drill and they can be timed for a minute to see how many words the student reads in a minute, and then they can graph their progress. But if you need to really increase a student's fluency and speed, I would recommend Read Naturally. That's a reading fluency program that we use here at the center, and it's very effective. It has nonfiction passages, and the passages are according to grade level. And the student does what is called a cold read, and they're timed for a minute during that cold read, and then the teacher notes any errors that were made, and then notes the number of words the student read in 1 minute. Then the student does a couple of repeated readings without being timed, and then they do what's called a hot read, where they're timed again for a minute. And the goal of the hot read is to get 20 to 30 words more read in a minute than they did on their cold read. And it's very motivating because you're graphing the results for the student to see. You're graphing their cold read and their hot read numbers, and you're seeing the progression over time. So that's something that I would recommend. Okay. I think there's another question in the chat,
Yep.
I think. Oh, you put that in, Stacy. Okay.
But then there's
Oh,
another one under me.
okay. Do you use the online version of Read Naturally or read live online? So actually, we use neither of those. We use the Blackline Masters. So we use the hard copies here at the center. But I know teachers who have used the online version and the Read Live, and it's very effective. Okay, any other questions that I can answer for anyone? Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Oh,
It was a
it was just
pleasure
a
to
thank
present
you.
tonight.
Thank you, Beth.
Thank
And thank
you.
you everyone for attending. Like I mentioned, we will send out the slides and the recording of this presentation tomorrow. And we have one more of the, whoop, Another thank you note. We have one more webinar before the academic year is over, so stay tuned for more info on that. I believe it's coming up in May.
There might be another question coming. Maybe not. Nope. Okay.
All right.
All right. Thanks, Stacy.
Thanks, gang. Everybody have a great evening.
Thank you.